I had only been at Blackwood High for 3 weeks when Elena and Caleb approached me. I didn't expect much from them at first glance. They were charming, sure, but I figured their sudden friendliness was the usual polite nod to the new kid. I wasn't used to being noticed, let alone invited to anything social. So, when they asked me to join them for a small, secret get-together on a Friday night, I hesitated. "It's nothing formal," Elena said, her voice smooth and persuasive, a slight smirk playing on her lips. "Just a few of us, away from the chaos of school." Caleb leaned in, his grin easy and reassuring. "Yeah, it's chill. You seem like you could use a break from all the small-town drama." I was hesitant but intrigued. The loneliness of being new made me crave a connection. By Friday night, I had convinced myself this was my chance to finally make friends. Elena texted me detailed directions to the spot, an old cabin in the woods near a creek. She described it as an old hangout spot used by students for decades. That part sounded normal enough, but there was something eerie about her phrasing. The woods just have a vibe you can't explain until you're there. The directions were clear, though they took me deeper into the woods than I had ever ventured. I parked my car at the edge of an overgrown dirt path and followed a trail under the pale glow of the moon. The forest was alive with faint noises, rustling leaves, the occasional crack of a branch. I noticed strange carvings on several trees as I walked. Symbols I didn't recognize were etched deep into the bark, their jagged lines catching the moonlight. A prickle of unease ran down my spine. I told myself it was just some bored kids messing around, carving nonsense to scare people like me. Still, I quickened my pace. The cabin emerged out of the shadows, worn and lopsided, with broken shutters and a sagging roof. A faint yellow glow flickered in the window, and I could hear muffled voices from inside. Relief washed over me, at least I wasn't alone. "Hey! You made it!" Elena called out, appearing suddenly at the doorway. Her wide smile seemed forced, her eyes too sharp in the dim light. Inside, the air was damp, and the walls were covered in the same strange carvings I'd seen on the trees. Candles flickered in every corner, casting long, dancing shadows. Caleb greeted me with his usual grin, but something about his energy felt different, too intense. "We were waiting for you," Caleb said, his tone light but with an edge I couldn't quite place. "Waiting for me?" I asked, laughing nervously. "Am I late?" Elena exchanged a glance with him, and for the first time, I noticed how synchronized they seemed, like they were communicating without words. "No," Elena said, stepping closer. "You're right on time." I started to feel uneasy. The room suddenly felt smaller, the flickering candlelight casting unsettling shapes on the walls. Before I could say anything, Caleb moved behind me. I felt his hand on my shoulder, firm and unyielding. "Relax," he said, but his grip tightened. Something sharp prickled the back of my mind, a warning I couldn't ignore. I turned to face them, forcing a laugh. "This is weird. What's going on?" Elena's smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. "We need you for something important, Mia." I backed up instinctively, bumping into the splintered wall. "What are you talking about?" Suddenly, Caleb grabbed my arm, shoving me against the wall. His face was too close, his eyes too wild. "Don't fight. It'll be easier if you just stay still." My chest tightened with panic. I twisted against his grip, my heart pounding so hard it drowned out everything else. Elena leaned in, whispering, "It's just a ritual. You'll be fine." That word, ritual, snapped something inside me. Adrenaline surged as I yanked my arm free, shoving Caleb with every ounce of strength I had. He stumbled back, and I took my chance, bolting out the door and into the night. The woods were darker now, the faint glow from the moon barely piercing the canopy above. My breathing was ragged as I sprinted, branches tearing at my clothes and face. Behind me, I heard them shouting, Elena's voice sharp and commanding, Caleb's lower and more menacing. My mind raced. I didn't know where I was going, I just knew I couldn't stop. Every snapping twig, every rustling leaf made my skin crawl. When I finally saw the faint glow of my car's headlights through the trees, a wave of hope surged through me. I threw myself into the driver's seat, locking the doors and starting the engine. Elena and Caleb burst from the woods just as I sped down the dirt road, their faces twisted in something far more primal than anger. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the lights on, my mind replaying every moment. By morning, I felt like I'd escaped a nightmare. But when I walked into my room, the air turned ice cold. My bedroom window was wide open. The muddy footprints on the floor froze me in place. They started at the window and led directly to my bed. A faint rustling sound came from the corner of the room. My pulse quickened as I turned, expecting to see them. But the corner was empty. I called my parents, my voice shaking as I explained what happened. My dad stormed into the room, searching every inch while my mom stayed with me, trying to calm me down. As my dad checked the closet, something darted past the doorway, a shadow, fast and silent. "Did you see that?" I whispered, gripping my mom's arm. "No one's here," my dad said firmly, but his voice wavered. The police came later that day, taking my statement and searching the woods near the cabin. What they found, or rather, what they didn't find, made my blood run cold. The cabin was gone. The area was nothing but overgrown trees and brush, as if it had never existed. And no one had seen Elena or Caleb since. The old Ridgemont Middle School stood on the outskirts of town, a hulking, skeletal reminder of another time. Its dark windows stared blankly at anyone who dared pass by, and the worn brick walls bore the marks of age, neglect, and graffiti, a perfect canvas for ghost stories and local rumors. I knew the stories, of course. Every kid in town knew the stories. They spoke of flickering lights at night, footsteps when no one was there, and the strange figure of a night gatekeeper, who would stop anyone brave enough to venture onto the grounds after dark. It was said that if you ventured too far into the bowels of the school, you could find things you didn't want to see. We never believed it. Not fully. Not until that night. It was just past 10 o'clock when I met up with the others. Jake, Sam, Lily, Ton, and Ethan. We stood outside the school gates beneath the faint glow of a single street lamp, the wind tugging at our clothes as we exchanged glances. "This is it," Jake said, pulling his hoodie tighter against him. His voice wavered under the pressure of the dark. "Are we really doing this?" Sam asked, his voice nervous, his hands jammed into his jacket pockets. I glanced at them, all of us standing there, young and scared, but driven by the pull of curiosity. "We'll just take a look." "Just to prove it's nothing," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. The gates were locked, rusted, and unmoving when we tried to push them. The place felt impenetrable, the shadows thickening at the edges of the metal. We glanced at one another, hesitant, until Ton suggested a way through the back fence. "It's not locked back there," she said confidently. Before long, we found ourselves navigating through a break in the chain-link fence. Our hands scraped against the cold, wet metal as we dropped onto the grounds of the old school. The air was colder here, the wind sharper. The entire place was dead silent except for the occasional groan of a door or the sound of branches scraping the pavement. We wandered into the school, our breaths misting in the frigid air, the dim light of our phones illuminating rows of lockers and cracked tiles. The air was stale, and the scent of rust and mildew lingered. I had the feeling we were being watched, but when I turned my head, there was nothing but shadows and broken windows. "Look at this place," Lily whispered, her voice uneasy. She was shining her flashlight down a hallway. The shadows danced as the beam hit walls and debris. "It's just an old school," I said, trying to sound brave, though my voice cracked a little. The wind howled through shattered windows, sending a cold gust down our spines. I wanted to turn back, but curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. The others seemed equally unsure, but the pull of the unknown kept us moving. We roamed through the classrooms, the remnants of old desks and whiteboards strewn about. Everything felt abandoned and forgotten, like the kind of place memories fade into dust. The sound of our own footsteps felt louder here, mingling with the eerie creaks and groans of the building settling. After a while, we found ourselves in the corridor near the bathrooms. It was quiet here, almost too quiet. Sam had paused to check his phone, and the sound of his breathing was the only thing breaking the stillness. "I need to use the bathroom," Jake said suddenly, his voice breaking the momentary silence. "Wait, Jake," Sam said, holding his phone out like a weapon. "What if the stories are true? What if there's something here?" Jake didn't answer. He was already pushing open the door to the boys' restroom. Sam and I exchanged uneasy glances as he disappeared into the dim interior. "That's it," I said, uneasy, "we're not going any further. Let's just stick to exploring the hallways and head back soon." But before we could discuss it further, Ton had already moved toward the girls' restroom. She was quick about it, a flash of confidence in her steps. "I'll just be a second," she said. We hesitated. Sam glanced at me, unsure, and I felt a twist of unease, but before I could speak, the sound of a faint noise came from within the restroom. It was barely a sound at first, a light, scraping, almost imperceptible. But it was there. My eyes darted toward the bathroom door. Sam looked at me. "Did you hear that?" he asked. Before I could answer, the noise came again. It was sharper this time, a quick, uneven sound. My stomach turned. "Ton." I called out, my voice cautious but firm. Silence. "Ton, are you okay?" The sound continued. It was like breathing. A sound unnatural, wet, raspy, and scraping against the tile. My palms were suddenly damp as I glanced at the door, uncertain of what lay behind it. "Hey, Ton," I began, but then she came through the door, stumbling into the hallway. Her hair was a little messy, her face pale under the weak light of the hallway. She looked at us, eyes distant, movements jerky and unnatural. Her expression was vacant, as though she weren't fully there. "I'm fine," she said, her voice flat. But something about her tone sent a shiver through me. I glanced at Sam. He looked equally unsure. "Are you okay?" I asked, stepping toward her. "I'm fine," she repeated, but this time her words felt off, as if they were being forced out of her mouth. Her head shifted oddly, almost mechanically. We all stared at her for what felt like seconds, too many seconds, unsure of what was happening. Her movements continued to feel strange, disjointed, unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. "Let's just go," Lily said, and before I could agree, she had grabbed Ton's arm. Wait, Sam began, but it was too late. We pulled Ton away from the restroom. She didn't resist, but her movements remained strange as we hurried through the dark hallways, hearts pounding, breath coming fast. It felt as though we had narrowly avoided something we couldn't explain, though no one said it aloud. We hurried home that night, uneasy and silent. Texts flew between us, confirming we had all returned safely. But the next morning, my heart sank as I stared at my phone. News reports swam into view. Ton's parents arrived at the school with the police. "She never came home last night." The words felt like ice in my chest. We had seen her, hadn't we? But it wasn't her. The question lingered, unspoken, terrifying. Who was in the restroom that night? University deadlines have a way of twisting time. 1 minute, you're weeks away from your project's due date, and the next, you're staring down the barrel of the final hours. That's how I found myself alone in the university art building one Thursday night, working feverishly on a sculpture I had poured my soul into. The art building was usually a hive of activity during the day, students chattering, tools clinking, and music blaring from someone's speaker. But tonight, the place was deserted, eerily still. It was well past 10 p.m., and the only sounds were the rhythmic scraping of my sculpting tools and the occasional hum of the old fluorescent lights. I focused on the clay bust in front of me, a figure meant to capture a mix of serenity and strength. It was almost there, but something about the expression wasn't sitting right. The brows needed more tension, the jawline more definition. I worked meticulously, losing track of time until I leaned back to take a break. That's when I noticed it. The expression had changed. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. Shadows danced across the clay, but there was no mistaking it. The once neutral face now bore a faint smirk, and the brows had shifted into a subtle furrow, as though the figure was watching me, amused. I blinked, stepping closer. My hands trembled slightly as I ran a finger along the contours of the clay. It was ridiculous, of course. Sculptures don't change themselves. I chalked it up to exhaustion, I hadn't slept properly in days, and let out a shaky laugh. "Get it together, Alex," I muttered, turning back to grab a drink from my bag. My phone buzzed on the table, startling me. I picked it up, expecting a text from one of my friends. Instead, the screen displayed an unknown number. "You're not supposed to be here." I froze. A prank. It had to be a prank. Maybe someone from class knew I'd be here late and wanted to mess with me. I put the phone down, forcing a breath and shaking off the unease. The room felt heavier, though, as if the walls were leaning in. Grabbing my tools again, I turned back to the sculpture. My stomach dropped. The bust was no longer facing forward. Its head had tilted slightly, just enough to be unnerving, angled toward me, as though it had been watching the entire time. My pulse thudded in my ears. I stepped back, my breath quickening. The room, which had been so still moments ago, seemed alive now. Every creak of the building felt deliberate, every shadow a potential threat. And then, faintly, I heard it. A scraping sound, distant but unmistakable. It echoed through the quiet halls, the kind of sound you can't ignore. My rational brain told me it was probably someone dragging a chair or moving supplies in another studio. But I couldn't shake the gnawing sense of wrongness. "Hello?" My voice cracked as I called out. No response. I scanned the room, my eyes darting to every corner, every shadowed recess. Nothing seemed out of place, until I realized my tools were gone. I had left them neatly arranged on the table beside me, but now the surface was bare. Panic gripped me as I scanned the room, and my breath hitched when I spotted them. They were across the room, neatly lined up on a far table. I didn't think. I grabbed my bag and bolted, leaving the tools, the sculpture, everything. My footsteps echoed down the empty corridor, the scraping sound growing louder behind me. By the time I reached the exit, my chest was tight, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely push the door open. Outside, the night air was sharp and cold. The quiet campus, usually a welcome sight, felt vast and unwelcoming. I ran until I reached my dorm, locking the door behind me. The next morning, I debated whether to go back. My logical side insisted it was just stress, maybe even a sleep-deprived hallucination. But something about that room haunted me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had missed something important. I called a friend, Sarah, to come with me. She agreed reluctantly, probably thinking I was overreacting. Together, we entered the art building, the sunlight streaming through the windows making it feel far less menacing. But when we reached my workspace, my heart sank. The sculpture was gone. In its place, scratched into the surface of the workbench, were jagged words that made my blood run cold. "I told you to leave." Sarah didn't need to ask twice when I suggested we leave. That was the last time I stepped foot in the art building at night. There's something about abandoned places that draws you in, even when every instinct tells you to stay away. That's how I ended up one summer night exploring the condemned wing of our university dorm with my friends Jake and Chloe. It was a muggy evening, and campus felt oddly deserted. Classes had ended for the day, and most students had gone home for the break. Jake had heard the rumors, stories about the wing being shut down years ago due to structural issues, but everyone whispered it was something darker. Mysterious sounds, disappearing belongings, and even tales of a student who went missing decades ago. It's probably just a bunch of broken walls and asbestos, Jake said, smirking as we stood outside the rusted door. Chloe rolled her eyes. Yeah, well, let's hope we don't need hazmat suits. I wasn't as sure about the whole idea. I mean, I liked a good thrill as much as the next person, but something about the thought of going inside gave me pause. Still, I didn't want to be the buzzkill. The door creaked open, revealing a dark corridor that smelled of mildew and decay. The air was heavier, almost oppressive, as if the space itself didn't want us there. Flashlights in hand, we stepped in. The first few minutes were uneventful. Dust clung to every surface, and the walls were marked with faded graffiti. The silence was what struck me the most. It wasn't just quiet, it was an absence of sound, the kind that made your ears strain for something, anything, to break it. Let's split up, Jake suggested. Cover more ground. I shot him a look. You've clearly never seen a horror movie. It'll be fine, Chloe chimed in, grinning. We're not in some cheesy slasher flick. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Jake and I headed down the main hallway while Chloe veered off into what looked like an old storage room. Jake was talking about some conspiracy theory he'd read online when my phone buzzed. I pulled it out, the glow of the screen lighting up the dim hallway. It was a text from Chloe. Come quick. Found something cool. I showed it to Jake, who shrugged. She probably found an old trophy or something. Following the pin Chloe sent, we reached the storage room. The door was slightly ajar, and the beam of my flashlight swept across a cluttered space filled with broken furniture and stacks of papers. But Chloe wasn't there. Chloe. I called out, my voice echoing faintly. Jake nudged me and pointed to a table in the center of the room. On it sat an old rotary phone, its cracked surface coated in a thick layer of dust. And it was ringing. Jake hesitated, his hand hovering over the receiver. This isn't normal, right? No, I whispered, my heart pounding. The ringing stopped, and then, just as Jake reached for it, it started again. This time, more urgent. With a deep breath, he picked it up and pressed it to his ear. Hello. For a moment, there was silence. Then a distorted voice crackled through the line, low and warped, like a recording played backward. She's waiting for you upstairs. Jake slammed the phone down, his face pale. What the hell was that? Despite every rational part of me screaming to leave, we climbed the creaking stairs. Each step groaned under our weight, the sound amplified in the suffocating silence. At the top, the corridor stretched out before us, dimly lit by a flickering bulb. And there she was. Chloe stood at the end of the hallway, her back to us. She was perfectly still, her head slightly tilted as if listening to something we couldn't hear. Chloe. Jake called out, his voice shaky. She didn't respond. As we approached, the lights flickered violently, plunging us into darkness for a heartbeat before snapping back on. Chloe was still there, unmoving. Something about her felt wrong. I reached out hesitantly, my fingers brushing her shoulder, and passed right through. Cold swept over me, sharp and unnatural, and I stumbled back, gasping. Chloe turned slowly, her face blank and expressionless, her eyes like dark voids. And then we heard it. Her voice, behind us. Guys, where are you? We spun around, and there she was, Chloe, holding her flashlight, looking confused and worried. When we turned back, the the figure at the end of the hallway was gone. We didn't stick around to figure it out. The three of us bolted down the stairs and out of the building, not stopping until we were back on the main quad, gasping for air. "What the hell happened?" Chloe demanded. "I've been looking for you guys everywhere." I pulled out my phone to show her the text she'd sent, but it wasn't there. No pin, no message, nothing. None of us spoke about what we saw that night, not to each other or anyone else. But I still dream about that figure sometimes, standing motionless at the end of the hall, waiting. And I swear, when the lights flicker in my dorm room, I can still hear the faint hum of that rotary phone ringing.